Hello and welcome back to the second part of our sci-fi scene. In the last part we created our nice GUI simulation, and in this part we're going to create the FUI and everything that's going to analyze it and things like that. Before we get into that, I'm going to do a bit of housekeeping. There's some things I've noticed having played it back a few times and done a bit more work on it. I'm happy with the camera comes to settle, then we've got our GUI kind of settling and stopping, and then pretty much after this point it's just going to have some kind of maybe a focus pull to the foreground, and we don't need this many frames. So I'm actually going to go to cut it down, and I'm going to clip it down to 300 frames. That's looking cool. And then the other thing I've done is I've actually gone into the cache, into this folder here, and I actually deleted any file above 150 because our sim comes to a stop at that point, so I didn't need it to carry on beyond there. So in reality we could have just cached up to 150. It's not a problem. These are all the kind of things you'll come across in production and have to adapt, but that's fine. Another one is that I think I want to cache this out as an alembic, and I tend to do that for sort of network rendering and a bit of robustness. It's fine as is, but I also want to throw a bunch of displacers on there. And there's currently one on there, but I find it, if you have more than one, it tends to become unreliable. So I'm going to export this as an alembic. And the way you do that, in R20, you can actually just right click and hit this one of these two, which is bake as alembic or bake alembic and delete. But you don't get a options dialog. So I want to use the options dialog. So I'm going to go export selected object as an alembic. And you can see here we've got these options, and I have a GUI mesh alembic there already, but I'm going to bake this one out as a separate version 2. Call it whatever you like. Hit save, and then I'm going to choose the frame range, which is the full range, perfect. And then everything else is good. We're using selection only, which is just this OVDB mesher. Global coordinates, which means no matter where I put it in the scene in any hierarchy, it will always load it from the position it should be. If I wanted to move it around later, you want to uncheck that when you cache, but we're not going to move it, so that's fine. Merge generated, I tend to have that on, and then I'm going to hit OK. And it will cache really fast because even though it's a lot of polygons and a lot of frames, it's already cached via XParticles, so it's just loading it in and it's just saving it to disk as an alembic file. It'll be quite large when we merge it in here. So if I go to File, Merge, and I merge this one in, you'll see it comes in with some options, and everything there is default. I think that's fine. And there we go. We get our OVDB mesh. And if I turn off our old one, I can scrub around and we see we get that nice there. And like I said, oh, you can move it actually. That's interesting. It's going global from its original source point, so that's fine. But what we want to do is I want to put that in there with the other one, deactivate the other one, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this, I wanted to layer up some more displacement. So I cached that out just then with the displacement active. I'm going to actually duplicate this displacement modifier, or deformer I should say. And then if you look, if I go to my my default camera, so default camera, you can see if I layer them up, you actually get a bit more of a sort of a bulbous, weird looking, it starts to kind of inflate in a way. You see the difference? And I could do that with some displacement in the material, but I quite like having it in the geometry for subsurface scattering and things like that. So, and it's got the animation in it, of course. So let's play that, looking cool. Excellent. Okay, so now we've prepped that up. I've actually brought in a material here, and it's called Viewport FUI screen, and I've got cycles material that's matching it as well. But to start with, we're just going to use the viewport material. And what this is actually a template I've created in Illustrator for something that will fill this screen. And we're going to work on this screen for a little bit. And I want to see some animation. So if I press play now or scrub, you can see it moves, the whole arm moves. So what I want to do is I actually want to detach that arm from the current simulation and not have it move. So there's a couple of things I could do. I could deactivate some of the expressions via the layers, but that's a bit something you might forget later on and you just want to change it. But if you go into the robotic arm and you go into the geo section, you see we have all these PSR constraints, and the one we're interested in is this last one. and you just go into the PSR constraint and you can turn it off there. And what that means is that now that just sits in place, and that's going to be a lot easier to animate to and to build things around. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a piece of geometry for the screen inside here. So I'm just going to add a plane. And what I can do is I can hold, whilst I have this screen tilt selected. Oh, I accidentally let go. Whilst you've got that selected, when you're selecting an item in a menu to add to the scene, you just hold Control or Command and it'll add it below it. But it'll add it in the position of the object, which is excellent. I'm going to make it a child of that. And then let's just drag our material on, just so we can see what it looks like and see the orientation. And you can see we've got these sort of weird words and things on there, but it's just a framework for us to play around with. You can create your own here, of course. And I know it's roughly 16 by 9. In fact, I know the texture is 100% 16 by 9. So let's change this to a ratio that's correct. So that's 16 by 9. And I'm going to move it up in Y, and I'm just going to rotate it 90 degrees. And then what I want to do is I kind of want to fit it in this screen area. Around about... It doesn't have to fill the screen because it's just... The texture is just this floating text. And you can see I've got a logo in the corner here that I don't want to get rid of. So I want that. And the spacing wise, that's actually pretty good. Is that centered? It's not centered in Z, so... or in what is the Y-axis on that. Just align it up there, nice and sort of zeroed. There we go. And that's now going to be our template. Now, if I reactivate our PSR constraint, it's going to jump over there, jump back into the main camera, and you can see now that's going to move with our object. In reality, what we're going to do is we're going to actually fade this on or mask this on in the comp. So it's not going to be there all the time. But for the purposes of what I want to do now, it's just purely matching. Oops, just changed my view. I wanted to go to my default camera. Use camera default. There we go. I just want it to sit here whilst we create some particle effects around here. So first one we're going to do is actually we're going to create a frame of particles around that kind of come out of this section here. So I'm going to turn off our PSR constraint again. Open that up, and you can see that's nice and static. Now it doesn't matter. If I look at my screen tilt here, we've actually, if you look here, we've got this kind of slight rotation, and it's not perfectly vertical. That doesn't matter. We can create stuff in this axis by using a work plane. We're going to align a work plane basically to this geometry. If you've never done that before, don't worry. We'll cover it in a second. In fact, if I go into my plane here, and I go into this option here, over here, if you look, there's these two axis grids, or work plane grids, sorry. And you can align them to different axes. I'm going to align it to the selection. So I'm going to align work plane to selection. And if you saw, the world axis or world grid just zeroed to that screen. And I'm going to call it screen geometry. Oops, extra T for fun. That's probably the most British thing I've ever said. And we can now look in the other views. And in the other views, we're going to get weird angles on some things, but the screen is going to be perfectly zeroed. Can you see how the whole scene is a bit off kilter? Well, if you look here, you can see our screen is perfectly flat, and especially going to be useful over here. Excellent. So obviously it's not particularly useful having everything overlapping. So what we'll do is we'll go to frame 0, by the way, just to make sure we're on 0. What we can do is we can start hiding some of our stuff that we don't need to see right now. So let's hide our ceiling. Again, this is why layers is so useful, because otherwise we'd have to be digging through the hierarchy over here. So, not render. Let's do hide the ceiling and lock it. Test tubes can go. Everything can go. The lights can be gone for now. Just cleaning up our scene nice and tidily. Now the controllers for this item here, we can probably hide everything except for this last element. So I will use the traffic lights for this one. So I'm going to hide the robotic arm as a whole. If I held Alt down, Alt Shift, it'll change it to that. And then just Alt click that one and it'll bring it back on. So now if I press scrub through, we can see we have a nice planar orientation. Now, why have I gone to this trouble of zeroing it to this axis? Well, I want to create a frame, or actually just an L shape kind of thing, and then we'll mirror it. That's going to be some geometry that we can emit particles off. So let's grab a spline. In fact, we could actually just start with a rectangle spline. And note when I add rectangles and things into the scene now, they'll be at the world, what is now our new world 0, which is over here. And I can just manipulate them over here. So let's grab our rectangle. Let's actually make it editable. I like when I'm in. Let's go to the full view. I can just use the modeling tool, scaling and stuff now. So it doesn't have to be completely perfect. It just wants to be pretty much aligned up with our outer edges and stuff here. Just slightly indented. Doesn't matter if there's a bit of overlap. And then I'm going to use I'm going to go to points mode, and I'm going to select these 2 points on the bottom here and just bring them up just slightly. There we go. We can adjust these later if it's not looking right. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually turn off close spline. And if I solo this, by the way, you can solo an object by going over here and just hitting solo. We can see that's isolated now and we can deal with it alone. Excellent. Now I can... you can see here the point order isn't quite right. We need this part to be joined and this part to be open. So the start of the spline is here, but I actually want it to start here. So I'm going to right click, select it, right click, set first point, and we get this nice U shape. Now the next thing is we need to make sure it's positioned in the Z axis, which I think because it's 0 to the screen, it'll be perfect, but we'll double check that. And also we need to work out the subdivisions. So let's unsolo that. So solo off. And then let's go to our main view, which is F1. Let's go and zoom in over here. And you can see it's not quite 0, so we might want to push it a bit further along, but that's not a problem at the moment. Just as long as it's aligned, that's the main thing. And you can model this in a separate scene. You could do whatever you like. Sometimes I do that, but in this case, it's quite easy to just manipulate it in situ. And if I add I'm going to add this rectangle to an extrude. So go up here, and there's these what they used to be called NURBs, but they're generator objects to generate geometry from splines and subdivide and stuff. So we're going to grab the extrude. So I'll hold Alt down whilst I add it, whilst I have my rectangle spline selected, and it'll make it the parent. And you can see now we're actually extruding 20 units on what is Z in our world space. I want it to move on the Y in our world space, so that's going to be the second one along. I'm going to exaggerate it to start with. I'm just going to do 10, but I'm going to have this is actually going to be very thin. And the reason I'm creating this piece of geometry is I'm going to actually emit the particles from it, and I want them to have the direction of the polygons. So it'll all make sense in a second when I add an emitter. But first things first, let's hide our grid. So filter, hide the grid, and at the moment there's going to be no subdivisions between each of these points because it's currently set to an adaptive intermediate points. If the angle is less than 5 degrees, add another point, whereas clearly we've only got 90-degree angles. And also we need to make sure we're showing lines, so display lines, and we're in an isopar mode because I can tell display wireframe, and there we go. What we want to see is when I go into my rectangle spline and I change it from another mode. So I could use like a uniform mode, you can see there, that's creating these nice subdivisions. The problem with this one is when you have these 90-degree angles, if you don't have a perfect kind of ratio or enough divisions, you'll see that corner curves up. And we don't want that. We want it to be perfectly 90 degrees in that corner. So the other one we could use, I guess, is natural. But natural would also vary the kind of spacing between our points. And I want it to be quite grid-like because this is going to be like, imagine it's like some kind of quantum pixels or some sci-fi excuse for that. So I'm going to change this mode to subdivided, and you can see straight away we get this nicely subdivided or nicely spaced divisions. And if I go to my corner here, it's perfectly 90 degrees. So that's awesome. I'm going to have to change how much that exactly is. I think it's probably going to be more like a subdivision of 3. And if we can always change this later, keeping it all procedural for the moment. Now I'm going to make that movement way smaller. So let's do 0.1. If I zoom in, you'll see that's really a really thin slither, and that's exactly how I want it. We could even go to, almost to 0. We can't go quite to 0 because otherwise I think that'll probably collapse it too much. But I'm pretty happy with that. I am going to move it slightly off the center axis here. Oh, it was Y, wasn't it? So it was negative Y. Just eyeballing it here. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. I sometimes get hung up on detail, so I'm going to ignore the fact that that's not completely perfect. And I am going to widen it touch so it's just sat inside that zone there. So you can use the scale tool. So if I hit T, we can do that. You see there, it just pushes it into that, and I'm pretty happy with there. Okay, so now we've got all that. Let's go to back to our isopalm view and clean that up a bit. Just makes it a bit easier to see to read the scene. And what we're going to do next is we're going to add an emitter that's going to emit from this. So we should actually name this. Let's call it Screen Frame Emission Geo. Bit of a long word, but long name, but that's fine. In fact, just call it Screen Emission Geo. Okay, so let's add an emitter from this, and in the latest version of XParticles, and there is a very cool option. So if you go to Quick Tools, or actually you can find this command in your commander as well, you can see this option here to emit from object. And so what this will do, instead of me having to add the emitter and set it up and everything, I can just hit emit from object, close that, and you'll see it's already set that up. Polygon area, and it's got a few different emission types. That's excellent. And one thing I should be careful of is we have another system in our scene with modifiers. So currently we should say only modifiers in the same system, but also we should probably put this in straight into a system to isolate it as well. So whilst we're doing that, let's just add a system, delete the default emitter, throw that in there, grab the geometry. We'll throw it in here for now. We're probably going to move the geometry at some point to somewhere else, into a null that will actually follow the screen, but for now it's not a problem. And what we'll do is we'll just hit play, just see how this works. Oh, first of all, do our usual checks. Only modifiers and only deformers in the same system. Turn the viewport icon off, and let's name this one Screen Edge. Let's just call Screen Edge, that's fine. Change the color just to, differentiate. Let's press play. And you can see our particles are moving really fast, and they're also emitting from the polygon area, which is not what we want. Right now, I'll go to emission. Let's just drop it right down to sort of 30 for now. We'll tweak all these settings, but let's get it roughly set up for now. And I want them to crisscross, that's cool. But they're kind of random at the moment, so it's a bit noisy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to emit them from those polygons that we created. So object tab, I should say. Polygon center, and you'll see we start to get a much more ordered or grid-like, kind of like it starts to look like a grid. In fact, it is a grid, but it's sort of sparse and weird and a bit random. So if we want that a bit more even, you can do things like make sure that their particles are only emitting on a whole frame. Currently, they're emitting subframes as well, which means that they'll be in different positions. So if I do turn off subframe emission, it's still not great. I think it's probably because I know what it is. It's because we're randomly emitting all over other polygons. So it's the rate is this 1,000 particles a second, and it's just randomly choosing a polygon. But we want to actually have it so that every polygon is always emitting. So what we do is we go down here, 1 particle per source element. So each emission frame, I'm just going to drop that down to a lower birth rate. You'll see now we get a grid. That's actually quite good density as well, so I think we'll probably stick with that. The only difference I do want to see is I don't want it to continue. So look, as you can see, it'll continue beyond the screen, way beyond the screen. I don't even want it to get too close to the center. I want it just to be on these edges. So let's work out. We should probably check the speed a little bit. So just kind of at the moment it's 30 units. That's actually pretty good. But definitely the age is wrong. So let's hit that here. Let's do 20, 10. And that's actually pretty close. Let's try a different 40. No, that's too much. That's too much. Let's go back to 20 with a variation. And the variation is what's creating this nice digital edge, if you like. So I'm pretty happy with how that looks. I think I'm going to add one more element to that. And of course, when we render these, we might be tweaking stuff. But for now, I think this is looking pretty cool. So that's called Screen Emission Geo. I'm going to actually change it to... well, it's not... It's taken the name from this object. So emitter, let's call it Screen Edge Grid. And then I'm actually just going to duplicate this one because we want the same pretty much the same setup, but I want it to do a different thing. So I'm going to control drag it, duplicate, and we'll call this one, I'm just going to call it spray. It's going to be like a mist almost, but much closer to the edge. Because in reality, you know, in this magical world, or it's not magical, it's science fiction, of course, is that it somehow it's be able to project these onto this surface. Maybe it's a mist or some kind of crazy stuff. But anyway, let's create this electrical whatever it's going to be. And let's change the color of the particles so we can see them nice and clearly. Let's change them. Oh no, actually, let's change those ones to squares. Let's change the edge spray to a different color. I've got a good idea of what color sort of theme I want for this. So blues and greens is kind of like the main HUD color with some reds and whites as well. So I'm going to make them blue. There we go. And I'm also going to turn it back to our area emission. So I'm not going to have the one particle per source element. Actually, no, I will have... let's try this. Let's try this. Leave it as exactly as it is. And in the particle direction, I'm going to use this cool thing. If you swivel down this swivel down icon here, arrow, you can increase this bit here and it'll actually spray the particles out in different directions, but they're still from the same point. If you can see there, it's kind of being lost at the moment. So I'm just going to turn the other one off. And you can see it is coming out of those areas, but if I go back down really low on that, you'll see it just start spraying them out in different angles. One thing I want to go back and change again is in the emission tab. I want the subframe emission back on so that we get loads of particles, and I'm going to increase the birth rate quite a bit as well. Well, our one particle per source element is actually causing it to limit it again. So I'm going to turn that off. That's definitely not enough. So we're going to go much, much higher. There we go. So we're currently at 10,000 unit or particles. Might even increase that higher. It will slow things down, but it'll look cooler, I think. So I think we do need to slow that down though. So maybe 10 and 5. That's pretty cool. So you can imagine these little nozzles here are spraying out this, whatever this is. I might have it a bit wider. Currently it's a bit bunched up. I think we'll definitely go denser for the final as well. Because you got to remember, when we've got these ones on as well, I don't want these to be lost. I want them to be quite a significant element. So let's really crank this up. I'm going to go to 100,000 per second. Maybe I'm going to go 200,000 per second. That's a lot of particles, so we'll have to be a bit careful on time. Wow, that's definitely stressing it out. But it's also probably stressing it out because it's doing the normal calculation for each of these. So it looks at where it is in the geometry, checks the normal, and then does its calculation. Let's go 100,000, and I think I'm going to increase this just a bit more. Yeah, just so it spreads out. I think it's got to spread out pretty quickly, and then fizzle out pretty quick as well. So that might help as well. Actually, is giving it a lifespan lower. So let's go to the emission tab again. Let's go for 10 and 5. Yeah, it's my usual kind of, I do sort of half a variation. Okay, and that's looking pretty cool, I think. Like I said, we're going to come back and probably tweak that a bit. I'm considering whether I should probably increase the number of particles again, depending on how it looks, of course. But no, I think that's pretty cool right now. So we'll see how it looks rendered and say that's pretty good for now. Okay, so we've got these unique names for these emitters. That's great. Let's color these emitters. I think it's always good to sort of give them a color just so you can identify them quickly in the object manager. That green is pretty good at the moment, so I'm just going to leave it default. That's all good. And yeah, I think I'm pretty happy with that. I could use a turbulence on these secondary ones, perhaps. Let's try that. So if I go to here, go to motion modifiers, turbulence. We want a really fine turbulence. So maybe we want something like a really low scale, so it actually moves them around, because otherwise they'll be just shifted around way too much. So something like that. Drop it to 2. And we don't really need to use groups here. I can actually just make sure that this turbulence is only affecting the edge spray by going to the grid one, going to its modifiers tab, and dropping the turbulence in the exclude. Now you can do that with groups. You can do that with including it in the other one and excluding it from this one just to make sure. But for simple stuff like this, I think just going into the one that doesn't have you don't want the mod in and just exclude it is fine. So go back to my turbulence. Let's just turn off grid for a minute. I just wanted to break up that. Yeah, there we go. You can see it's breaking up the direction a bit. Nice. And we could even have that come on over time. So we could go to mapping tab, hit add. If you go to the object tab, you can see the one we want to change is the strength. So I'm going to go to mapping. The parameter we want to change or map is strength. And then over age we could do, or lifespan. Lifespan's more useful because it knows how long the particle's life is and it's relative to that particle. So that's useful. So I'm going to have it ramp up pretty quickly. And let's press play. So it's nice and ordered when it comes out, and then it just starts to break up a bit more as it comes out. Excellent. Proof will be in the cache and when we see it rendered. So I'm pretty happy with that. And I think now we could actually have it in situ and start animating where we need it. Because if I put my if I unhide the robotic arm and we turn on our, remember we turned off our, open this one up, screen tilt. By the way, I did a little trick there. This is something I like to do. If I have imagine if I expand all of these, if you hit Control and open these, this is a pretty heavy hierarchy to navigate, and you can use soloing with your layers and things like that, but it can get quite tricky. So what I tend to do is if I'm in the viewport and I know there's an item that I need to get to, like I'll select it. So I know actually, in fact, it's this one. I'll select it. And then I'll use the command, which is scroll to first active. And what that is it's a default. I've got it set to S. So if you hit it, it scrolls down in the hierarchy straight to that object. So even if these are collapsed and I hit S, you'll see it takes me straight to that object, and I'm already where I need to be in the hierarchy. So that's just a little tip there. But let's turn our what we were here to do. Let's turn our screen tilt on. I just realized that. Yeah, we'll have a look, see how that goes. So you can see that's moving along. Obviously the playback is much slower now because we've got these hundreds of thousands of particles pouring out the edges there. But that's the first problem we'll have to solve. So, and I don't want it to start that early because let's just turn it off for a second. Oh, that's the goo. Let's turn that back on. You see, if I scrub along here, I don't want it to come on until we're about here, sort of maybe 50 or 60th frame, because I want it to kind of activate. So I want it to, like, once the arm is in position, this activates and then carries on. So let's actually do that now. Let's set the emission to start at that point. So let's go emission. I've selected both of them. Oops, it's minimized there. There we go. If we go to the emit in all frames, we uncheck that, hit 60 of the start frame, and then the end frame is the 300. So that's fine. And that means that once it gets down to here and the arm stopped pretty much moving, that's going to be when it starts off. So that's pretty cool. Now we could either have it following the arm, or we could just transfer this whole system to that point in time, which I think is going to be a lot easier. We could, I'll tell you what we could do if you wanted to see that, just to demonstrate it. So go back to where it's at its default 0 position, and then take this whole system and make it a child of the screen, or screen tilt null down here. I'm just going to put the grid one on for now, just to keep the playback nice and fast. And you can see there, that's working pretty well. I'm pretty happy to leave that as is. Excellent. So we can actually cache that in place if we want to get some decent playback in the viewport. Or we could just leave it deactivated for now. I'm going to actually cache it. I think that's a good idea. So let's go to Other Objects, XP Cache, and then I'm going to create a new cache. In fact, I'm going to rename this cache to Screen Edge. And then these all have unique names, so that's great. And I'm going to make sure that it's only going to cache everything in the system that the cache object is inside. So only cache in the same system. If you want to be really safe about that, you can go to the Inclusion tab, hit Include, and literally just drag the objects that you want to be included in there. That's actually really versatile. I love that about the cache object. So okay, let's actually build this cache, and I'll come back once it's cached, and we can continue adding some more HUD elements. All right, so that was pretty quick. That took 3 minutes to cache out those 300 frames. And if we scrub here, we can see we get a nice quick playback now. It's not perfect. We're still getting, because it's having to display everything, so it's not 100%. But there are some tricks you can do with that. In fact, you can go to the display settings and like reduce the amount of the cache. But I'm happy to have them in the scene. And if we think it's the spray ones loading in that's giving us the most slowdown, we can just turn those off, and yeah, it is. Not too much though, to be honest. So I'm gonna leave everything on. At this point, you're definitely advised to start exporting out hardware renders. I've got a good idea of, because I've done some research on this particular scene, I've got a good idea of the timings and stuff. So that's pretty cool. And next up, we're going to actually have a look at how to create some sort of cool looking overlays for our goo mesh down here. So let's first off, let's we can actually deactivate this screen edge layer whilst we're working on the rest. And I'm going to go, we're in our default camera. In fact, let's have a look at that shot, by the way, in the main camera. Turn it back on. Yeah, it's going to look cool. We're going to have these fade out. So we might recache these later depending on how I want to color them. But I think I can just use their age to fade them off. So they're going to be fading by this point. And they're going to be quite subtle, remember. So it's not going to be quite as loud as that. All right, so that's cool. Deactivate that for now. Quite happy with that. And next up, let's take a look at how we're going to create some interesting looking effects on here. So let's jump into our default camera just so we don't interfere with our main one. Use camera default. There we go. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to use this geometry that we have here already to generate some interesting looking elements. So what we have here is we have a cache. So let's go and have a look at these objects. So we have this emitter here. If I turn it on, and let's turn our OVDB mesh off for now. If I scrub through, you can see we've got a bunch of particles. Oh, I've just gone beyond the hold frame. Oh, I didn't. Yeah, sorry, I meant to do a hold frame on this one actually. So do hold frame. Yeah, if you scrub past a frame where the cache is actually ended, the emitter will just continue simulating, or any of the XParticles objects, they'll try and continue simulating from that point. Obviously, we don't want that. So what you do is you go into the tag and you hit hold frame. You can actually do that as a global action as well in the cache, but I like to have the control per object. Anyway, I digress. So currently we've got this this goo coming out here. One of the things I quite like to be able to do is actually isolate some specific particles, and from this UI up here, if I actually get the doodle tool out, this is always a fun tool. If I just create a doodle frame, just if you click anywhere you'll get a doodle. This is not the training, by the way. So if I just scribble there, that's cool. So what I'm gonna do, go to my brush, get a nice vivid color. What I want it to do is I want it to maybe isolate some of these particles. Let's put our mesh back on, probably better contrast. There we go. And I want it to highlight them and put a sort of a circle around them maybe. And then I want them to all join back up with up here with this, and maybe kind of like, maybe underline this here. And then, oh wow, this is some wonky lines here with my Wacom pen. They won't double up like this, but you get the idea. We're basically going to have it so that as this is, as the camera's landing kind of thing, we're going to see these particles being highlighted by this, and then that makes sense with this readout, that kind of stuff. Okay, so how are we going to do that? We actually need to find the positions of some of these particles and track them. And what we do with for that is we actually use XPresso. So I'm going to go to the first frame and make sure we're in the default camera. We are. Turn our mesh off as well. There we go, press play. And each of these particles has a unique ID, and we just need to access that ID and then extract the position and then apply that position to an object that we're gonna choose. So let's just minimize these hierarchies. I'll leave the emitter one open. And let's add a null. So first off, add a null. And I like to make them spherical just so you can see them wherever they are. And I also like to, if we move over, now remember, that's actually a good reminder that our grid is now all the way over here. We do not want that. So let's make sure filter grid is on. And we're going to change our grid back to the work plane Y. There we go. And then this, we can just reset the PSR. So if you select an object, get Commander up, reset PSR, you can see this command and it'll drop it to the 0 of whatever the parent is. And if there's no parent, the world 0 is the parent. So back to 0 here. Let's just bring it up here. Now it'll face the camera. If I have it on default, it'll just face the camera. I want to actually see it in 3D space. So I'm going to change the orientation to XZ. There we go. And you can see it now. Now, how am I going to pin it to one of those particles in here? Like I said, we're going to use XPresso. So actually let's add another null and we'll call this, because this is going to have our XPresso tag. In fact, no, actually no, I'll create it on this one. So we'll call this particle follow. We're going to right click it, XPresso tags, XPresso. XPresso opens up for you. Now, if you've never used XPresso, it's actually quite simple once you get your head around some basics. But what we need to do is we actually need to access some XParticles data. And what we need to look at is for the XParticles operators. So I'm actually going to open the system operators and you'll see you get a list. And then we want XParticles. And then if you look here, we've got all these. We've got general, iterator, and data. You don't need to have to worry about any of them except for the data ones. And what we want is we actually want to get the particle data. So let's just drag that in and see what it gives us. So that shows us this node, and you select the node and you see these parameters. And you've got an index and you've got an emitter input here. Now we could drag the emitter in via just dragging it in. But if you want to make it a bit more dynamic, you can actually drag the emitter into from the scene itself. Go to objects. So what this does is it means like you right click this port here, or sorry, not right click, you just click on the port here, and this is an out port, and then you need to find object, and what that means, it'll feed whatever the node is, which happens to be an emitter object, because this is an object operator, and you connect that up to the emitter. So that's accepted an object and an object output. If you right click these, you can actually get port information. So you can see that the direction is an output, the name's an object, and it's an instance. So it's an instance of the object, and then the value is instance. If you right click this one, you'll see that it's an input and the object an object, and it just means that you're feeding it an object. So that's cool. Okay. Now, what do we do next? So we've done that. That's interesting. Not really. Let's have a look at the outputs on our get particle data. So we're getting the particle data. We've attached the emitter. It has an index parameter, which we'll play around with in a minute. But we want to actually get the data off the particle. So we look here, we can see age, color, count, direction. The one we want, of course, is position. So hit the position. And then what we want to do is, because we now have this position, if I do result, there's a result node in XPresso. I just drag that into there. You'll see if I optimize that, change the type to vector, because positions are vectors, obviously, X, Y, Z. And you'll see that's the position of our particle at the index of particle 0. And if I start changing these, you'll see we get all these different positions. And so now what we know we can do is we can actually feed that into our null. So we actually drive our null's position. So let's drag our particle follow null, click on the inputs, go coordinates, global position, and then just the whole global position. We don't want to drive just one axis, just the whole global position. And let's connect that up. Boom, straight away, the particle jumps to, and if I try and move it, it's not going to move because it's being driven by something else. And if I scrub through my scene, you'll see it emits and then moves through the scene. Now we chose one that doesn't happen to move that far, so let's play with the index. So let's increase the index. Oh, even just jumping one, jump to a different one. And remember, the particle indices are going to be shifting around. They're not going to be changing, but their position as they roll past their neighbors and the fluid simulation determines where they are. There we go. So that's pretty cool. So now we know that that's going to sit nicely over there. What we want to do next is choose... is that actually climbing over there? Just interesting. I think that might have just pushed through the wall. Oh no, it does climb over. There you go. I was confused there. I thought it actually pushed through the wall and we had a problem, but we didn't. So let's go to our particle follow again. And one thing I'm going to do is delete that result node. We don't need that. Now, currently, it's a bit laborious to keep going into here. If we have multiples of these follow objects, and you click on them and go in here and keep having to change the ID, is going to be a bit of a pain. So what we're going to do is we're going to add some user data to our particle follow null. Go to user data, add user data, and this will bring up a HUD, a dialog. And we're going to call this particle ID, or particle index really, but let's just call it ID. And let's change the interface from a float to a float slider. In fact, it's actually an integer because it's only whole numbers, remember. So integer slider, we're not going to limit the maximum. So slider minimum and slider, we don't want to go to negative values, so we do want a minimum. Let's hit OK and just see what that looks like. And you can see here we get this slider. Problem is the slider has that infinite value. Well, it's not infinite, it's a 64-bit number. But let's go to manage user data again, and let's set the slider maximum to, let's say, 5,000. Oh, manage user data. What did I do wrong there? Oh, we do need to set the maximum. So there we go. So we do have to have, yeah, maybe add another. There we go. So it's never going to go beyond that. And set our maximum slider length to that and our minimum to 0. There we go. Just test it there and it's working fine. Default 0, no problem. Press OK. There we go. So now our slider is going to be from 0 to 5,000. If it doesn't find the 5,000th particle, it'll just default to the largest number. So how do we feed this number into our particle data node, or get particle data node? We're going to actually make we're going to take this null reference and we're actually going to create another one. So it's actually exactly the same object, but I'm just going to put it in here. It's just I could actually feed it from here, but I'd rather put it over here and make it a bit tidier. User data ID, particle ID, index, and there we go. So now when I slide this around, we can control it from inside the scene rather than having to dig into XPresso each time. Excellent. So that's getting pretty close to what we want. Now the next thing, I think the last thing, is that I actually want the naming of our null to actually look like, or to be the ID as well. And the reason for that is I think it'd be good to have it just so that I can see straight away which one's which, so like separate them. So all you need to do for that is actually, if you drag from this output, hit it to this blue input on the particle follow, and in fact this is the same object, so that's why we can do this. Go to basic properties, name, and if you saw, it immediately changed the node names and also the object name. So you can see here as I change that, it's going to change. Perfect. And it doesn't matter that it's not named kind of obviously, because this is going to be a child of another hierarchy. Okay, so that's great. And we'll talk about references quickly as well. So now if I duplicate this and I jump into here and I change this one, it's going to be correctly referenced. So you can see here, that's perfect, that's great, and everything. But it's called an absolute reference. And what that means is if I actually create another null or even just a different object, let's grab say you want to grab I don't know, pyramid, there we go. Put that over there. Now, if I drag our XPresso tag onto that, nothing happens. And the reason is that the XPresso tag is still referencing the other object. So if I double click it, you'll see it goes back to that other object. What we want the actual XPresso tag to do is actually reference relatively, so to whatever object it sat on. So if I select this one and select this one, and I just hit relative reference, and it'll automatically now be in relative mode. Now, whichever one I copy it onto, it will jump onto there. The problem with this is that I don't have the user ID on the pyramid, but that's fine. If I copy it over, you can see, and I actually, oh, hang on a second. Oh, double click into there. Yeah, so if I double click onto this one, you can see the pyramid, it says undefined because there's no user data on there. But if I just pull those open, you'll see this one. Oh, where's the emitter? Because we had an undefined thing, sometimes XPresso just stops calculating, so that's fine. But you can see I can now transfer that to another object. Not going to be much of a problem in our case because we're actually just going to use duplicated nulls. So I'm going to duplicate 2 more nulls. Let's have 3 objects. And I want them to travel quite far. So let's choose some kind of ones in a distant position. I think if it's too like bunched up, let's try. Yeah, I want them to kind of follow the fingers along quite far. Ooh, that one was quite good. Yeah, that's quite nice. There's so many particles here, obviously. You just a bit of trial and error until you get ones that you like. Yeah, maybe that one. Yeah, that's cool. And the ones that we want are kind of like going to be sat along the edges there. Awesome. Yeah, let's just go for that one. And now we're going to set up how are we going to link these together with those spline lines coming back to our screen. Now that's where it's going to get a bit interesting. So we're going to actually use some tracer objects and some things that aren't XP, but the source data is from our XP object. And you can see now if I actually, let's give these some colors. So basic, I'm going to turn the color on to automatic. And let's just make these nice and bright. There you go. You can see them following along their particles. Cool. And we'll have them coming on. We'll kind of have them scaling up probably as that comes into position. But first, let's connect these up. So first of all, we're going to add some tracer objects. And we're going to kind of use a combo of tracer objects and MoSpline objects to kind of draw on the paths. And let's tell you what, actually, let's hide. The UI is a bit cluttered at the moment. I like it to be a bit cleaned up. So I'm going to just hide our cameras. And then I'm also going to go to filter. I won't filter actually. I'll just hide these modifiers in this hierarchy. Okay, it's a bit better. And we can also hide those. This is all cached as well, so it could even be off. All right, so let's start setting up these wires, and we're going to need a few more nulls. So we want the nulls to actually be up here where the screen is. So if because we're in the default camera, I can spin around here. And you can see I can put it, basically I'm going to put them in line just under that biohazard line basically. And the ones that connect up, actually it's going to connect up to one null here, and they're going to connect to each of those in turn. So let's create a null at this point. And do you remember if I said earlier, if you add a null or add an object with another object selected, holding Control or Command down will put it in the position of that object. So that's perfectly now in line with the screen. And I'm going to place this just about here. Let's give it a bit more of an obvious shape. I'm going to make it a cube. Make it an XZ. Give it a smaller size as well, just so we can see it in the viewport nice and easy. And then let's create another null, and I'm creating it inside this screen tilt so it actually moves with that object, and that's actually going to be desirable later on. Let's put that one there. This will all become really obvious in a second what's going on. So I'm going to call this point 1. Call this 0.02, and then all the others already have their names. Okay. And now what we're going to do is connect these up using tracer objects. So if up here, we're going to create a new null, because we can create this all outside of this hierarchy. These want to be following, if I move the arm, you'll see those now move with the arm. Excellent. And I'll hit, I'm going to add another null. So add a null there, and we'll call this our, what's this going to be called? Our labels, I guess? Or particle labels, something like that. And we're going to drop those. Let's put those in there. Excellent. And let's add a tracer object. So let's grab our first tracer object, and then we'll probably be duplicating after that. So if you go to MoGraph, tracer, make it a child there. And let's do, the first one we'll do is we'll connect up these first 2 points. So point 1, oh, is it, because I had an object already selected, it threw it into the trace link. Sometimes you want to be careful with that. So I'm going to have point 1 to point 2, and then I don't want it to trace all paths, I want it to connect them up. And I want to make sure there's so connect all objects, that's perfect. I also uncheck trace vertices, because there are no vertices here, and sometimes that doesn't work, so I turn that off. And we'll call this tracer 0.01 to 0.02. And that's great. Now I'm going to duplicate that, and this first link to one of our particles is going to be exactly that. So we'll call this part 0.02 to 543. That's going to be annoying if we change that later, but it's fine. Fine for now. Fine for now. There we go. And you can see that's connected up. And the cool thing is because it's a tracer, you can see it follows, and we get this nice connected up line with our screen. So it's like the data is being fed back, or the UI, the augmented reality of this screen is tracking a real item in real time, supposedly. So let's duplicate that and do the same for the other two. So 699 and what's this one called? 952. Just replace those last, because we're still connecting them back up to 0.2. And there we go. Excellent. So that's actually our points are connected up nicely. And you'll see them moving along there. But the thing is they are currently on all the time. So we don't want them to be on all the time. I'm actually going to drag them to the bottom of our hierarchy here. There we go. And what I want to do is I actually want to use MoSplines to animate them, basically animate these lines. So what we'll do is we'll keep it fairly simple. We'll have a MoSpline per object. So add a MoSpline. We can use the same suffix. So I just copied the suffix from the tracer above it. I'm going to change the MoSpline to spline mode. Go to the spline tab and throw the tracer in. And now let's just double check which way around it is. I'm going to turn the extensions off because I don't want it to go beyond, so I don't want it to be able to do that. So turn the extends off. And then, yeah, that's animating perfect. So end to start, perfect. And we can actually throw some keyframes in if we want. So, I don't know, let's start frame 50. 20 frames is way too much. This is actually the first line, so it's going to be quite quick. I think I've defaulted these scenes to linear as well. So with the keyframes, you want to be careful. In a scene, so if I go Control or Command D and I look at my key interpolation, I currently have the default set to linear. I actually want to change it to spline and let it calculate those based on that. It just means I sometimes like having it in linear because it just means that you can then go in and edit them and it's quite obvious. But for this case, we're going to use some automatic keyframing. And we might tweak them later as well. So let's just make sure that's animating. Yep, perfect. And now we've got some keyframes on these. We can actually create these other three pretty quickly. So let's add this one. And I'm going to create an individual one per tracer because then that means we can animate them slightly differently each time. So let's copy the suffix. Let's do the same with this one. And then one last one for the one down the bottom here. Okay, so let's connect up the spline. So go to the spline tab in each of those and make sure it's connected up with the one above it. Perfect. And they've all got the keyframes on, so they're just going to animate together. And we kind of want to make sure the timing's reasonable on here, so we'll just tweak that. So let's select all three of the MoSplines at the bottom here. Make sure they don't start before that 60th frame. There's a bit of a lag from when it starts, and they're way too quick because they're going much further distance. We want it to be fairly constant. So let's just drag that keyframe. I'm selecting the keyframes by holding Shift on this time bar here and just drag, and it'll give you like a selection of that keyframe. Okay, that's starting to look pretty cool. Let's look at it from our camera view, actually. Press play. You see the animate on. I think that's pretty good in terms of timing. I think I'll extend these a touch more. How long was that first one? That's fine. There's a touch of lag just as it kind of hits that first. So I'm probably going to take this last keyframe here of the first part, and let's hit Shift F3, and it'll take you into your timing editor. You can see I've got a bunch of other keyframes from other objects, but we want to just check this MoSpline one. Let's go to our F curves, and yeah, I'm going to just reduce that so the speed in is kind of not slowing down much. There we go. And then on these, all these three here, I think I might just reduce that down a bit and then ease them in as they arrive a bit more. I'll leave that up to you guys to play around with. And yeah, there we go. So we're landing on frame 90, and I think that's where we'll have our nulls here scale up. And in fact, they probably won't be nulls. We'll probably use some geometry. So I'm going to use a circle spline. So let's throw a circle spline in there, drop it in as a child of the null, and then we can use that PSR reset command. So PSR, or reset PSR I should say, just click it and it'll reset it to there. Now if we make it nice and similar size, so 10 units, and then if it's 10 there, and then it has to face the camera. So currently if I select our nulls, and you can see our display is this sphere. If I make the sphere much smaller, just so it's out of the way now. And you can see our circle, and as I select it, you can see it's not facing the camera. It's actually aligned to this XY axis. So what we need to do is we need to add a look at camera tag. So right click, Cinema 4D tags, look at camera, and it'll face the camera. Perfect. And it doesn't matter that it's kind of getting hidden a little bit. It'll still show up over the top of our underlying geometry. Especially when I hide the mesh, because the way we render this, you'll see later on. it's going to be in layers. So we'll do a FUI layer and a geometry layer. So now just duplicate that circle, reset the PSR for each of those. Perfect. Now we can just keyframe up that animation. We could just scale up the nulls, to be honest. It doesn't particularly matter how you do it. Or you just keyframe up the circles themselves. So let's just do that. So frame 90 is when it hits. So I want to add a keyframe to these. So just you can paint down those there. I want that to be 0. And they're going to scale up really fast. So let's do it over 10 frames, see how that looks. Always remember to render out to check the timings. That's quite nice. Over those 10 frames, or 20 frames as it is now. Actually, I think they're slowing down too much as they come in, those splines. So let's go back to our MoSplines, go back to our timeline, go to the F curve, and don't have them quite slow down quite as much. I just want to have the momentum to kind of drive the scaling up of those other particles, or circles, I should say. Select the circles. Let's give them a color, just so we can see them nice and clearly in the viewport. And they're not scaled up yet. There you go. So we see them. And let's do something just to make it nice and clear in the viewport what's going on. Let's hide our traces. So I select them all. Just hide. Oh, I should just hold Shift Alt Shift even, and you'll just hide them. And then our MoSplines currently, they have this weird kind of dual line display. And if I select all of them, we can go to the Object tab, change the display mode to single line or just line. And let's give them the similar color as well. This color is kind of doesn't matter at the moment. We might use them later on, but just for now, it's just purely for viewport purposes. Okay, great. So let's press play. And you see now we have this nice element picking up our particles. Awesome. So next up, we're going to do one last pass, which is going to be, we're going to have some elements over the surface that are going to react to the way this geometry is moving. And what we're going to do for that is actually we're going to use quite a simple technique. We've already used one of these objects in our scene already. We're going to use a flow field. And the cool thing about the flow field now is that we have an object that we can render those cool looking velocity vectors out of. So we have one in this section here. So if I actually show a long spline, and I show 2 spline. Let's hide our emitter for now, just turn it off. And they're currently hidden, so objects, display, show vectors, and we can see all those vectors. Now that one is way too busy, so I think we'll, sorry, let's go to the editor camera. That's way too busy, so we're never going to be able to see what's going on there. And also I will probably want it a bit more flat to the floor. So we'll tweak these. Let's if I turn one off, let's just see what the other one looks like. Yeah, they're too dense, but we're going to create some unique ones just purely for our rendering purposes. So they're hidden. Close that hierarchy off, no problem. And also let's show our weird stuff, the goo. Turn that back on. There we go. Excellent. So let's add another flow field. Go to XParticles, Dynamic Objects, Flow Field. Dynamic in that it responds to the surroundings. Let's make it really isolate around this object over here, and make sure it's reduced down. And I think we're going to increase the density. Currently it's 40, which is, you know, not very many of those voxels. So I'm also going to change the display mode to line. So display line to line. I want it to be not direction only. And I want to go back to general. Let's drop that down to, let's go 20, 10, I think 10. Let's make sure it's actually covering our mesh. And let's change our mode to surface normal. So I want it to respond to the surface normal of the object. And let's drag our mesher in. So let's try that out. And you can see we get this cool looking vertex, sort of velocity field, and which is actually the source of everything. I'm going to make our direction 0, strength 0, just so that it adds nothing to our scene and doesn't interfere with any other systems. But we'll put it in its own system in a second, just to make sure it doesn't. Let's change the fall off, because at the moment you can see the fall off. I can actually control how tight it sits to the mesh. So I only want a few coming off the outside, and I think that's probably where I want it, something like that. And to keep the performance up, let's have it above the ground. We don't need, because we're not visualizing anything below this surface, so we can actually lift it up until there's none. Like so, but still making sure to include that top part there as well. Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. Now, here's the cool bit that we can now do. So how would we render that in previous versions? We couldn't actually render that. So now we actually got this cool new object. So XParticles, generators, and there's this thing called XpDisplayRender. And what this does is it takes a bunch of different inputs, so it can either take particles, emitters, flow fields, or modifier displays, a modifier field, sorry. And what it does is it actually turns it to a spline. So I can take this flow field display here, activate that, and then I connect it up with our flow field, and immediately you see we have these splines. And it even stores the color data on them, which is really cool. We're probably going to strip the color data off it later, but for now, that's absolutely fine. Let's start naming some of these objects just so we know what it is. We'll call this FUI normals. FUI normals on this one as well, just so it's all obvious what these are. In fact, I don't even, that one I can just say flow field. Let's put them in a hierarchy. It's going to be quite a sparse hierarchy, but it's fine because we're not going to add too many more objects to this. Put that in the generators tab there. Excellent. So we can actually, something to note is that if this isn't generating any display data, nor will the display render. So if I hit display and it doesn't display anything in the source object, it won't display it in the actual splines. So that's looking pretty good. Now the cool thing is as I press or drag scrub through the scene, you can see it adapts to our object. And that's going to feel, hopefully, quite sci-fi. Excellent. So I'm going to hide I'm just going to hide it from the viewport, the flow field itself. Let's set our system up, make sure it's on our usual defaults. So let's only modifiers in the same system. Drop the icon in the viewport, and let's give our... let's make this one a yellow one, I guess, because it's a flow field. There we go, and we'll call this FUI normals as well. All right, and the rendering of these, this is all, we'll tweak some of these settings perhaps when we come to rendering it in the next section, but for now, I think that's pretty cool. So let's go back here. If we want to add another one as well, we can just duplicate this and do some different kind of maybe tangents or something like that. But I'm kind of happy with how simple that's looking. One thing I might add is a spline, a long spline one on the ground. So let's, because I kind of like it's got a predictive mechanism. So if I open this one up and we steal the along spline, or actually let's try the along spline first and we can change it. So I'm just going to duplicate that over here, put it over there. Let's make it exactly the same size as this other flow field. So let's just round these numbers up. And let's match them. So 180, 35, 190. So 180, 35, 190. And then make sure that they're in the same spot. I could just make it a child and do PSR reset, or I could use the transfer tool. However, all these tricks are going to just kind of speed up things. Resolution, that is quite dense at the moment, but we might like that. Now, I don't want it to be quite as tall as this. I just want it to be on the surface. So I'm actually going to have it on the, just one, you can see that's just one thin plane there. Just above the surface like that. And then display, the fall off's quite high. You can see if I turn direction only off and then reduce the distance around the spline, that's looking pretty cool as well. And we can turn these objects on and off depending on how we, in terms of the render, when it comes to the render. If it's too busy, we'll just turn them off. But have at it in exploring all the different ways that you can make this look cool. So let's do a long spline. And I will call that one normals, just so that it's clear which one's which. So I just duplicated that, but I didn't change the association. So let's throw that in there. And that's now generating splines. If I make this one of these objects editable, by the way, you'll see current state to object. You'll see it is just made up of hundreds, if not thousands, of splines. But it's efficiently kept in this one encapsulated object. Excellent. Right. So let's go back to our main camera. This would be a good time for a hardware render. And let's close these down. Let's hide the original along spline one. Close that up. And let's play back our scene. Let's put some more stuff back on. We will definitely not get real-time playback, but I just want to get a feel for the motion. So everything's back on. Press play. So our remember this is only a template, this thing in the screen, in the scene at the moment. It'll be wiped on in post. So that's looking pretty cool. Now, I'm not so sure about the lines on the ground because it is a predictive thing. But what we could do is to make that look a bit more interesting is actually have it animate. So we can actually have a MoSpline reference the original spline. Let's just do that quickly. Let's turn that off for a second. That'll actually deactivate the normals, but that's fine. And this one here is let's call that goo root, just so we know what naming it is. Let's add a MoSpline, just like we did before. I need to go to my MoGraph tab. There we go. MoSpline. Let's throw that in to just other objects. There we go. And let's make it a spline mode one. Spline. Select it and then grab our goo root one. And you can see there. Now, this will probably animate a bit weirdly. Yeah, sort of different routes, different speeds. If I do it as separate segments, they'll actually animate on like this. So we might want to actually divide this up to stop it from doing that. Let's duplicate this goo root and have it as our source for this spline here. And I'm going to change it from adaptive to uniform, which basically means that it's got even subdivisions. So like when I now go back to here and I scrub, it's going to be quite a constant speed. And that's probably going to look a lot more interesting in our along spline. So let's replace our goo root here with our MoSpline. Let's turn off our normals one for the second, by the way. And, oh, I haven't animated it yet, so let's... Where are we? There we are. So we need to animate this, of course. So let's give it a keyframe here, 0%, all the way to 100 here. Pretty randomly placed. I'm not too worried there. Probably, let's put the goo back on, because otherwise we won't know timing-wise what's going on. Yeah, I think that's pretty cool, because it comes on just before the goo and kind of, yeah, I like that. So remember, it's just HUD stuff, so it you know, if you've got some justification for it in a sci-fi scene, there's no problem, but don't sweat it too much if it doesn't make too much sense. And we can always turn them off. So I'm pretty happy with how this scene is shaping up, or has shaped up, and I think now would be a good time to do some caching or a hardware render, and then we jump into the rendering section. So if there's anything we can cache here, we should, and I think we already have, to be honest. So let's go to our Our screen edge is already cached. There we go. We can't cache these. Well, we can cache these splines actually. That's true. So these MoSplines, we could actually cache them as one unified MoSpline, but for now I'm going to leave it as is, and we'll work that out in the rendering section because this has gone on a fair bit anyway. Okay, so that's our complete source geometry and splines and particles and everything for our rendering section. And yeah, we'll move on to that one next. So let's save this. I'll probably run a hardware render and we'll review that at the beginning of the rendering section. Okay, see you in the next one.